Parsha of Tazria Metzora. While the bulk of the portion deals with the enigmatic condition of tzorat, which is a type of skin disorder, which we'll speak more about during the week, a spiritual skin disorder, which usually is translated as leprosy, but it wasn't leprosy. But the portion begins about the laws of childbirth. Interesting. It begins by saying that if a woman conceives, gives birth to a male, so it says that she's ritually impure for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, the child should be circumcised. The flesh of his foreskin should be circumcised on the 8th day. And then she's ritually impure for another 33 days before she's able to go to the temple, to the sanctuary. And then it goes on to say, if she gives birth to a female, then she's ritually impure for 2 weeks. And then for another 66-day period, basically double the amount of time that she is ritually impure when she gives birth to a male. And then she brings offerings. So in other words, before going to the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, to bring the offerings, she can only do so after a total of 40 days for a male and 80 days for a female. There are some very strong questions one can ask about this. First and foremost, why would she be impure after giving birth? Why? You're bringing a neshama, a new soul into the world. What can be holier than that? What can be more sacred than that? So for this, she should be in a state of spiritual impurity. Bizarre. Doesn't make sense. And then the obvious question, double for a female? If she gives birth to a male, so for 7 days, she's spiritually impure. And then an additional 33 days after that, 7 days, and it says 8th day is circumcision, so 33 days plus 7 is 40. And then double that for a female. Why should she be? She's penalized for having a female? This is an area of the Torah which we have great questions regarding the differences here in gender and sort of favoring the male, that you have the ritual impurity for a male for only 7 days and for a female 14 days, and the additional days which double it, 40 and 80. Very bizarre and very troubling. Let's give a brief answer on this, which we can answer. This is a general principle. The whole topic regarding gender differences is a much greater topic, much beyond the time we have allotted for today. But let's focus on a principle that we can touch upon. We could answer these questions by asking another question, because that's the typical Jewish thing to do. Why is the mitzvah of circumcision brought up in the context of the laws of spiritual purity and impurity? It says here, if she gives birth to a male, so for 7 days she's ritually impure. On the 8th day, the child is circumcised. Why does it have to be here? I mean, this is thrown into the mix, thrown in over here, that on the 8th day he's circumcised. Why is that here? There is the concept of ritual purity is an area of the Torah which is very mysterious. It's not something which is as a result of hygiene, where the person, as a result of coming in contact with impure objects, he's now hygienically unclean, and therefore this was somewhat of an early FDA guidelines that the Torah is giving us back in the ancient times of the desert, while the Jews were before entering the land of Israel. So there was an early period of time of giving us basic hygiene. It's not. The Torah makes it very clear. It's something which is spiritual. We don't see it. We don't sense it. But there is a dimension we don't see or touch. And by the way, today we can relate to it somewhat during a time of COVID, which clearly things which are beyond our ability to see and touch. It's microscopic, and yet can change the world. So this is beyond our senses. In Judaism, there is an emphasis on an underlying layer of spirituality, a layer that exists within our own self. We have a body and a soul, which we can't sense with our physical senses. But yet, we know it exists. The soul that exists in all of reality, which is the meaning and purpose beyond it all. Now, there is, just like on the spiritual level, there is holiness. There is also a spiritual level which is unholy. We can relate to it on an energy level. We can relate to something which is an energy which is upbeat, lifts us up. And then there is sometimes we could sense an energy which drags us down, schleps us down. In the teachings of Kabbalah, it teaches where does the negativity get its vitality from? Where does the unholiness get its source of life? So the teachings of Kabbalah describes that unholiness doesn't get its life force directly from God. It usurps its life force from any remnants of holiness. So it's sort of like bottom feeders. The forces of unholiness get life and vitality in areas where there is remnants of divine sparks from holiness. As a result of that, there is it receives its vitality. There's a law in Jewish practice that in the morning we are to wash our hands, netilat yadayim. And the reason for this is twofold. One, it's hygiene. So once again, regarding COVID, is something which is built in within Judaism. There are many situations where a person is guided and instructed to continuously wash their hands. So we wash our hands in the morning. Another reason for this is because of spiritual reasons. At night, when we are unconscious, the soul goes into a subconscious level. The neshama goes on high, a great portion of the neshama, which is our consciousness. As a result of that, there is a state of impurity that sets in. Why? Because naturally, when there is absence, when there was a place where there is holiness, and now there is the absence of holiness, unholiness steps in like a vacuum in order to get vitality. Now when the neshama comes back, the consciousness is back when we wake up in the morning. The unholiness leaves. Except it remains on our fingertips, and that's why we wash our hands. So the principle is, when there is, in an area where there was once holiness, in its absence, unholiness comes in. Based on this principle, we can understand this enigmatic portion of spiritual impurity for birth, for childbirth. Why is it that a woman who gives birth, that she goes through a period of spiritual impurity? Why? It's the holiest thing you can do, bringing life into this world. That's true. And that is why when she gives birth, what happens? When she gives birth,
she separates.
The neshama that was once within her, she had a neshama, a soul, an additional soul within her. And now when that soul comes out, there's the absence of that holiness. So therefore, temporarily, there is spiritual impurity. There's unholiness that sets in. Which is why the concept of mikveh after menstruation is also something which is along the same lines. It's something which is misunderstood, that a woman who is menstruating, she then becomes spiritually impure because hygienically she's unclean. Nothing to do with that. Absolutely nothing to do with it. Because since she had potential life within her now, and that has left, so there's a temporary state of spiritual impurity. On the contrary, it emphasized that she carried within her, at that moment, a greater state of holiness. Now, based upon this principle, we can understand the difference between male and female. By understanding why in this context is there a mitzvah of circumcision. The mitzvah of circumcision is about creating a bond. That's what circumcision is, a covenant, the covenant of circumcision. That here on the 8th day, a child is born, and on their 8th day of birth, they're creating their bond, their circumcision, their bond with God. Well, how about a woman? Why isn't she circumcised? Somewhat of circumcision. I mean, there are tribes, even till today, in other parts of the world that have female circumcision. And you're talking about here biblical times. Why couldn't there be female circumcision? They are left out. They don't have this bond. They don't have this covenant. So the Talmud, 2,000 years ago, makes a very powerful statement and says, a woman is born circumcised. A woman is born with that covenant. So for a male, what needs to be done in order to create that bond, for a woman, she's born with that bond. She's born with that covenant, implying that there's a greater spiritual sensitivity and alertness and consciousness that a woman has that a man doesn't have, that a man needs to do in order to fulfill that bond. But for a woman, it's intrinsic. Now we can understand not only the context, why circumcision is mentioned here, but also the double spiritual impurity. Based upon this, which soul naturally has a greater alertness and sensitivity and connection and bond? A female neshama, which is why in Judaism, it goes after the mother. If the mother is Jewish, the child is Jewish. It follows that. There's a greater connection with the mother. So a male that is born, the spiritual impurity is a total of 40 days. For a woman, since the neshama has a greater level of holiness and spiritual divine connection, intrinsic connection, therefore, when that neshama leaves, there was a greater holiness that left, which means there's a greater presence of unholiness temporarily after that neshama, after that soul leaves her own body. So here we have an example of an area of the Torah which is enigmatic, puzzling, seems to denigrate and makes a difference between men and women to the point where a woman is denigrated. On the contrary, it points out the greater element and the greater spiritual sensitivity and connection that a woman has. So,
except in Shul, they got to sit on the other side.
Except we have to sit on the other side. No, the principle over here is very basic. Again, I said that this concept is a very broad concept which needs explanation at every step of the way. But the basic level is that for a male, what we need to do in order to connect, for a woman, it's intrinsic. So, for example, tefillin. On Shabbat, are we allowed to put on tefillin? We don't put on tefillin on Shabbat. Why? Shabbat is holy. Tefillin is holy. So maybe if we should put on tefillin on Shabbat, we're super holy. Why not be super holy? Tefillin is a divine connection. We bind our mind, our action, and heart. We connect, we align ourselves by putting on tefillin. Why can't we do it on Shabbat? Because Shabbat, it's intrinsic, it's happening by itself. When we tap into Shabbat, Shabbat it is on its own. So if we put on tefillin on Shabbat, we're actually denigrating the Shabbat. It's an insult to Shabbat. The principle we brought out today is, on many levels, the mitzvahs that a male needs to do in order to connect, a woman intrinsically is connected. So for a woman, if she were to put on the tefillin, what she's actually doing, it's an insult to who she really is. She doesn't need the tefillin in order to connect. She is tefillin. It's built in her. Like the Talmud says, a woman is born circumcised. If a woman were to circumcise, that would be considered mutilation. It's not a covenant, it's a mutilation. Because she is connected. She doesn't need the tefillin, she is tefillin. So we can go on with all the other concepts associated with it, but beyond the scope of the discussion. But here we have the principle. A woman is. A man needs to put on a yarmulke. She is a yarmulke.
Oh, is it?
A man once turned to the Rebbe and said, after a wedding, a bride and groom is considered like a king and a queen. So the person asked the Rebbe, so how long is the bride? How long is the groom considered the king of the household? So the Rebbe said, as long as you treat her like a queen. So we have to remember That's why we say the Eshes Chayil, the woman of valor, and point out the greatness, the great quality, the greater spiritual quality that a woman has.
Okay.
So here we have our men group coming together. It's for us to remember.
Thank you so much.
Good job.